Okay, so this video is going to be about the anterior thorax, all right? And we have this gorgeous, beautiful picture right here. This was hand drawn by Valerie Batcher. She's an occupational therapist who worked with me in creating this anatomical workbook, the Gross Anatomy Study Strategy. So if you really like these images and the way I go through these images and the muscles layer by layer, you can have that for yourself in this workbook that we have. And you can access that workbook in the description below. Okay. Anyway, we're going to continue. So you guys are getting a sneak peek to this workbook. And you're going to see how it works. So anterior thorax. All right. So when we're looking at this, one of the main things that I want you guys to bring your attention to is the fact that we have 12 ribs, right? We have 12 ribs, but all these ribs are attached to this this big mass of bone right here in the middle. And this big mass of bone right here in the middle is known as the sternum. Okay. Now the sternum itself is divided into three main components. You're going to have this piece that's all the way at the top. You're going to have this part in the middle, and then you're going to have this tip of it all the way down here at the bottom. Okay. And so when the first anatomists were looking at this bony piece of bone, they likened it to a sword. So they basically said, you know, this right here is the handle of the sword. And if you look at in Latin, the Latin word for handle is manubrium. All right, manubrium. So this is the manubrium of the sternum. This right here is all the body of the sternum. And then the tip down here is known as the xiphoid process. Xiphoid process. Okay. And altogether, these three components right here make up the sternum. And as you can see, all of the ribs, except for ribs 11 and 12, are attaching onto the sternum. Okay. Another thing we're going to see from this is that the ribs themselves are going to be made up of a bony part, and then the part that actually makes contact with the sternum is not bony. It's actually made out of cartilage. Okay, it's made out of cartilage. So this piece of each rib right here that we see that's attaching with the sternum, we call those the costal cartilages. Coastal cartilages. And every time you hear the word coastal, that is referring to rib. Okay, so those are the coastal cartilages, and the rest of it will be the costal bone. All right, or costal bone. Okay, all right, so we have that. And another thing I want to point out is the fact that these 12 ribs are not just articulating with ribs 1 through 10 are articulating with the sternum, but all of them, ribs 1 through 12, the whole 12, are all articulating with vertebra, okay? And specifically, they're articulating with the thoracic vertebra, T1 to T12. So right here, what we added in was we labeled the body of these vertebra up here. And you can see that this one is where the first rib is articulating. So that one right there must be vertebra T1. And the one directly above it must be vertebra C7. Okay. And likewise down here, we can see that the last rib is articulating with this vertebra right here. So that must be T12, and this one down here must be L1. Okay, so we got that. Now, those are basics. Now, let's look at some of these attachment sites that we're going to be talking about for the musculature that we're going to look at on the anterior thorax. So first of all, we're going to start with this bone right here. All right, this is the clavicle. The clavicle is the point of contact between the sternum and the rest of the upper extremity, or the appendicular skeleton. This right here, this part that is the vertebra and the ribs, is known as the axial skeleton. And this part out here of the scapula and the humerus is known as the appendicular skeleton. The clavicle essentially serves as the bridge between axial skeleton and appendicular skeleton, okay? So the joints, for example, this joint right here, the sternoclavicular joint, is a very, very strong joint. Okay, it's a very, very strong joint. The clavicle will break before this joint is dislocated. Okay, because this is the only point of contact between the appendicular skeleton and the axial skeleton. Okay, so this is our clavicle. Okay, and then on this end out here, On this end out here, what we see is that this label is pointing to this right here. And in the first video, when we talked about the anterior arm, we know that that's the coracoid process, that sharp beak-like process that is projecting out of the scapula. That is the coracoid process. And I forgot to label this guy up here. This is the clavicle. As we said, that's the clavicle. Okay. And then we know these guys right here, right? What is this? This tubercle over here. That tubercle is going to be, let me make this font size just a little bit smaller so we could fit all this in there. So that right there is going to be the lesser tubercle of the humerus. Okay. The lesser tubercle of the humerus. And that is this label right here for this thing. Okay. If that's the lesser tubercle, what is this out here? That is going to be our greater tubercle, our greater tubercle. Beautiful. Okay. And what is the sulcus? What is the sulcus, or the groove that separates these two tubercles? This little shallow depression in between the two tubercles, that right there, that is going to be our what is it called? The intertubercular groove. All right, the intertubercular groove. That's it right there. Okay. Beautiful. All right. And then this right here is going to be the shaft of the humerus, right? This is kind of like a review of the first video. This is the shaft of humerus, but you're going to see how this is important for the muscles that we're going to talk about. So that's the shaft of the humerus. And then this out here, remember, these are your epicondyles of the humerus, right? So this one on the lateral side is going to be the lateral epicondyle. Okay. And then this one over here is going to be our medial epicondyle. Beautiful. Okay. Our medial epicondyle. Okay. And with that, we have all the bony landmarks, the more important bony landmarks that you need to know for the anterior thorax. Now let's jump into the musculature. So first muscle I want to talk about is the pectoralis minor. So the pectoralis minor is going to be the deepest muscle that we're going to talk about here, and it is lying deep to the pectoralis major. Okay, so the pectoralis minor is going to be attaching to ribs 3 through 5. All right, ribs 3 through 5. It inserts on ribs 3 through 5 onto their costal cartilages and also onto the costal bone, and then from there it's going to go up to attach onto the coracoid process. So that's going to look like this. Okay, so it's kind of like that little serrated kind of formation to it. So remember, I told you there's 3 muscles that attach to the coracoid process that act as shunt muscles. Okay, they're going to be the pectoralis minor, the coracobrachialis, and what is the other one? The short head of the biceps brachii. Okay, 3 muscles attaching to the coracoid process, and this is one of them. All right, lying superficial to that is now going to be the next muscle, pectoralis major. Okay, and so pectoralis major is a very large muscle. Everybody knows what pecs are, and when they're talking about pecs, they're talking about the pectoralis major. Okay, so pectoralis major is a huge muscle, so it has a very vast amount of attachments. It's going to attach to the costal cartilages of ribs 2 through 7. Okay, so all of the ribs that are making direct contact with this sternum, okay, are going to the pectoralis major is going to attach to them. Okay, it's also going to attach onto the sternum. Also, it's going to attach to this part of the manubrium here, and it's going to attach to this medial half of the clavicle. Okay, and we're going to see later the other muscle that attaches to the lateral half. Okay, but for now, pectoralis major attaches to this medial half, attaches to the sternum, the underlying costal cartilages of ribs 2 through 7, and then from there, all these muscle fibers will run out laterally to insert on the lateral lip of the intertubercular groove. Okay, the lateral lip of the intertubercular groove. So this essentially means, remember when I said that the intertubercular groove is also known as the bicipital groove, because you have the tendon of the long head of biceps that runs through that groove, right? And remember how we saw in the previous video the teres major inserting onto this medial lip over here. But now we have the pectoralis major, which will attach onto the lateral lip, okay? And what it's going to do is essentially that as the long head of the bicep runs through this groove, the pectoralis major is essentially going to cover that. it's going to run over that tendon and cover it. So if you were doing a cadaveric dissection, for example, you cannot see that long head of the tendon of the long head of biceps. You cannot see it if the pectoralis major is still attached to the humerus. You're not going to see it. It's going to block that. Okay. So this is what that's going to look like. Boom. Okay. So the pectoralis major is attaching all over here, and then it's going to attach there. And you can see from how it's situated, it will be able to pull the humerus back towards the midline so it can do adduction, okay? Adduction of the humerus, okay? In addition to that, we know that the pectoralis major is also capable of producing flexion of the humerus, okay? And also does a movement which is known as horizontal adduction. Okay, and the horizontal adduction movement is what a lot of people do to work out their pectoralis major muscle. Okay, beautiful. Next one we have is the anterior deltoid. When we were looking at the posterior scapula and arm, we saw the posterior deltoid. Here, I'm going to show you the anterior deltoid. Okay, so we saw the posterior deltoid attaching to the scapular spine on the posterior aspect of the scapula and the deltoid tuberosity. Over here, we have the anterior deltoid, which is going to attach to the rest of this clavicle, which has some real estate open for us. It's going to attach to this lateral half of the clavicle and also onto the acromion. And then from there, it's going to go down to attach to the deltoid tuberosity. So that's going to look like this, okay? And that muscle essentially is going to be able to not do adduction as the pectoralis major does, right? Because this muscle is running over the outside of the shoulder, okay? It's not coming from the inside like the pectoralis major was, right? So it's running over the outside. So it's going to pull this deltoid tuberosity up and around this way, okay? So that's going to cause abduction, pulling the humerus away from the body. Okay, and the anterior deltoid, being the fact that it's situated anterior, it has this anterior bias. It's also going to be able to produce a small amount of flexion at the shoulder and also a small amount of internal rotation. Okay, but mostly the deltoid as a whole is really producing abduction of the humerus. Okay, and that's it. That's all she wrote for this video. I'll join you guys on the next one. Gross anatomy is one of the most difficult subjects in the world. Luckily, it doesn't have to be. Anatomy is one of those subjects that needs constant verbal and visual repetition in order to get good at. What better way to reinforce this information than with the scientifically validated method of drawing? Neuroscience has shown us that we retain information better when we physically draw it out. That is why the Gross Anatomy Study Strategy Workbook is designed to walk you through all the layers of the musculoskeletal system, allowing you to draw the muscles into place. This is excellent for reinforcing muscle attachments, bony landmarks, muscle names, and actions. This will save you tons of time from mind-numbing tactics such as repetitive flashcards or passively listening to boring lectures. With this strategy, you can actually begin to enjoy studying again and have a much better way to retrieve the information. Order a copy of the Gross Anatomy Study Strategy today at the link below so you can spend less time being stressed and more time being blessed.